Real pleasure to invite Dr. Donovan to take the spotlight.
Well, thank you so much. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. Just confirm for me. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, and then I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to ask you to confirm that you can also see my screen, because sometimes I get rolling and people can't see what I'm talking about.
Can see it,
Good.
Joan. Thank you. It's good.
Awesome. So you should see some painted over butterflies, and we'll talk a little bit about this style of attack. I am really excited to talk to you all about this talk title, which is very vague. So I appreciate you coming in. Sometimes I can never tell, what it is that we're going to want to talk about in a given day, given all of the massively awkward situations that we've been in over the last few months in the US related to misinformation and of course our elections. It was sort of the height of geopolitical embarrassment to allow a president to foment a mob on social media that tries to destroy Congress. So mea culpa. Uh, my biggest apologies from the US. But I, not many people know this, but I will wave hello to friends and family from Montreal. But I went to Concordia, and I was very excited to be able to talk to different audiences about this kind of work, because there is a very sort of US way of seeing the internet and of seeing misinformation as a kind of technical problem that could be fixed if you just, got platforms to tinker at the edges of their products. But today I'm going to try to convince you of something slightly different, which is essentially that misinformation at scale is a core feature of the current design of our social media environment, and that no one solution set is going to get us where we need to go. And one of the first rules of misinformation, so Donovan's laws of misinformation, is that there's no communication without misinformation. So we don't approach this from the perspective of, oh my God, somebody's wrong on the internet, because that happens all day, every day. The point is to try to understand, well, when is what's wrong scaling, reaching new audiences, breaking out of the bubble of conversation that it started in and reaching new people? And is that breakout strategic? That is, are there certain people trying to, kind of make it happen? Thinking back to the movie Mean Girls, that line about stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen, right? With misinformation at scale, we see a lot of failed attempts to make misinformation the thing or the topic of the day, or some kind of, way to change media agendas. So my hope with this talk today is that you come to see the world as we see it, as misinformation scholars and as researchers of socio-technical systems. That is the relationship between technology and our media, and technology and our politics, and technology in our societies. So a few definitions just to set us all on the same pace here, which is this is an old cartoon about the internet, but it still holds true to today. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And apparently on Zoom, you can be a lawyer and a cat at the same time. If you saw that meme yesterday, it was pretty funny. Someone showed up and they had one of those special effects backgrounds, and he was trying to have a conversation with a judge, a remote hearing, and he's saying, "I'm not a cat, I swear," but it's the cat talking. So it's very funny. High quality content, very much appreciated in this day. But when we're talking about media manipulation and disinformation, we're talking about a few key definitions. One is media is an artifact of communication. It can be a set of text messages. It can be posts on social media. It can be a book, a documentary. Our historians and our archivists know it can be literally anything people remember to collect. And put in a dusty old box in a basement. So media is a very broad kind of like communication studies 101 definition. But manipulation, we think of a little bit differently in our team, which is to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. And what's important about that, why we leave artful in there, is because hackers, artists, activists have long used media manipulation techniques in order to shift public conversation, in order to cause a scene. And in doing so, we just kind of hold out that piece of the definition in case we want to study things that aren't necessarily uh, malicious in intent, but do use deception in order to prove a point. Disinformation, though, that is bad news. Okay. Disinformation is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. And what's important about this is precisely that when we're talking about disinformation, intent is very hard to prove. In fact, if we can't find why a certain hashtag is trending or a certain piece of media is going viral, we often think, actually, this might be the work of foreign influence operations or people that are paying for advertising or other kinds of services to make content become much more highly engaged with. And we're going to be publishing a couple of case studies related to cloaked science and where did society come up with this idea that COVID-19 is a bioweapon? Well, it actually comes from a media manipulation disinformation campaign run by Steve Bannon, who used scientific archives, preprint, websites to place a strategic piece of what looks like science into onto these websites in order to then be able to point to them and say, hey, something terrible is happening here, and a scientist is blowing the whistle on COVID-19 as a bioweapon. And Steve Bannon, of course, was responsible for many disinformation campaigns in the U.S. and at one point had been in charge of Breitbart, which is a right-wing news organization. And then from there, he went to be the chief strategist with Trump before he was fired for whatever reason. Trump lets a lot of people go. But he came back at the end of Trump's campaign and over the last year in the US to launch some of the more important and impactful disinformation campaigns against our public health agencies and against our government. So what do we do? Where do we do it? We typically publish our research at the Media Manipulation Casebook, so mediamanipulation.org. It's a place where we publish case studies. We see this website as a kind of research platform and an open textbook. We are going to be providing different kinds of trainings for people to learn how to write and investigate write about and investigate media manipulation campaigns. But for us, the Casebook is a digital research platform linking together theory, methods, and practice for mapping media manipulation disinformation campaigns. This resource is intended for researchers, journalists, technologists, policymakers, educators, and civil society organizers who want to learn about detecting, documenting, describing, and debunking misinformation. And so that's available to everyone. And one of the things that I've been very blessed as a researcher is to have different support for projects like this that allow us to do our research both in a way that is intellectually and academically rigorous, but also is digestible enough so that people in other fields aren't afraid to read it. As you know, academics often get accused of being, well, in the nicest of ways, pedantic, and in the worst of ways, completely irrelevant. And so we try to strike a balance on our team as being knowledgeable about what's happening in the field, but we treat theory like underwear, which is to say that we wear them, but nobody knows that we got them on, right? So but all of our researchers are A plus intellectuals, and happy to roll the tub around about any kind of theory that might from journalism to communication to political science to sociology that might help us get where we're going, in order to come up with, obviously I'm going to avoid the word solutions, but come up with ways to mitigate the damage done by media manipulation campaigns. So other things you're going to find on the website are these definitions of these tactics that we've seen used over and over and over again, where disinformers, will intentionally hide who they are, and they'll hide their intent. And they do it in a way that really cloaks what they're all about. And they use different tactics to do that. So keyword squatting, which is, if you were to, search on Facebook right now for any celebrity's name, you're going to find information about that celebrity and then a bunch of other stuff. And that's because people are squatting in the keyword. They're taking advantage of your interest in a politician or your interest in a celebrity in order to sell their wares, or to, kind of offer up some kind of, gossip or whatever kind of content they're trying to market. As well, recontextualized media. So this is when media manipulators will take a short clip of something and and repost it in an entirely new context where there's not a lot of knowledge about what's going on. Of course, in the case of Trudeau and the blackface incidents that we saw during the Canadian elections, there was a lot of recontextualized media. So the pictures of him that were reposted with false context. Other attempts, though, that we saw to remix media about Trudeau also involved forgeries, where because Trudeau would not come out and say how many times he had done blackface, it actually introduced a vulnerability into the system where anyone could generate convincing fakes that made it look like he had dressed up as, the most infamous one was, it looked as if he had dressed up as Hitler. And that was being posted on a bunch of different websites. But that is recontextualization. And then, of course, misinfographics, that is making it seem like something is scientific when it's truly not. And so we've seen time and time again, there's a bunch of different definitions of tactics on our site that you can comb through and start to understand the mechanics of how disinformation campaigns become convincing. That is, the point is to fool you, right? The point is to make you believe. And they have a bunch of different tricks for doing that. So our framework then for study is what we call the media manipulation life cycle. So every case study that we do, which I'll go through some in a minute, is we try to understand where in the life cycle has a media manipulation campaign really started to scale and take off. So we look for stage one, that is, can we find places where people were planning this campaign? If it's the case that they're trying to spread a false picture, can we find through reverse image search the original place where people started to work on that image and create this idea that, for instance, that Trudeau had dressed up as Hitler? We actually tracked that back to a YouTube comment where someone had originally, Ham Sandwich, that's his screen name, Ham Sandwich had originally posted this picture, which then got taken from the YouTube content and started to then be seeded across the web and platforms in new ways, right? And so sometimes these things take on a life of their own. We, though, most likely discover a media manipulation campaign in stage 3. That is when people start talking about it. Like I said before, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times a day, people are wrong on the internet. But it really only starts to matter when people of note start to respond. That is, industry, journalists, politicians, activists, celebrities. Are other people getting involved in spreading the misinformation and moving it around in specific ways? And is that movement somehow strategic, or are they using that's when we start to look for, well, are they using fake accounts? Are they purchasing engagement? Are they using advertising? How are they making something go viral? For the first couple of years of doing this research, there was really nothing to put in stage 4 in terms of mitigation. Disinformation would happen online, and then nothing else would happen. Right? Like, platform companies weren't going to take it down. It was all considered fair game, even as like white supremacists and others ratcheted up racist and intolerant content. Platform companies still considered that, free speech. Um, but over the last 2 years, we've started to see platform companies develop in-house security services that will start to label certain content. So you probably saw a lot of fact checks on different content on Twitter or Facebook over the last year. That's an effect of me and other people in this field just banging on the door saying, you have to do something, because this stuff is starting to really not just disrupt our politics, but it's actually touching down in people's lives and hurting them. And we can demonstrate those harms. We can tell you very clearly that if not for this Facebook group, we wouldn't have had a young man in Kenosha, Wisconsin, shooting at Black Lives Matter protesters. And so we've been really, as a research field, uh, pushing as hard as we can alongside advocacy and civil society to get platform companies, especially Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, to understand what they have built. And that's no easy feat. The last thing we look at is the adjustments by the manipulators to the campaign. Like, what happens after mitigation? How do they recuperate? Do they try again? Do they re-register accounts if the account has been banned? If a journalist has debunked it, how do they pivot? And so that's how we study this in terms of a framework that allows us to look at these campaigns in situation, in context, that then allows us to make much broader claims about the impact of disinformation on our society. We got a whole slew of white papers. I won't go through them now, but on mediamanipulation.org, we've really tried to make it easy for people to know what we know. And so please feel free to cruise through those white papers and use them in your courses, or cite them in your research. We are very grateful to be in a position where we can do both academic peer-reviewed research as well as some quick and dirty white papers. But I promise you, we've cited all our sources. A little bit of theory. The way we see technology is very much from the point of view of science and technology studies. Specifically, I often look to Chris Kelty's book, 2 Bits, to understand, the early formations of how geeks understood the relationship between technology and society. So his book, 2 Bits, is called, the subtitle is The Cultural Significance of Free Software. There was a time in early 2000s, where academia was really working on a way of thinking about the internet as this decentralized web. And there were also others, this is the days of AOL, America Online, in the US, where the internet was starting to understand itself as an industry, as as part of the communication industry. And what Kelty writes in 2009, which is really at the kind of moment of the very beginning of social media, thinking here about Friendster, and I know some of us even remember, some of you are like, MySpace, what? But this is really, when Facebook is back in its early days, only allowing people with .edu to register. They were not everything to everyone. Twitter was kind of known as a place where techies would, banter, but it wasn't, the place it is now for premier, top-notch journalists to be engaging with the public. And YouTube was a dating site. YouTube was really about you uploading a video of yourself and being like, I'm funny, I'm smart, I like walks on the beach, I've got a cat. Be nice to meet someone with similar, ideas about, so like the replacing of like VHS and DVD dating, for instance. So these sites didn't come with a social purpose in the way that they've kind of grown into what they are now. But Kelty writes, geeks fashioned together both technology, principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, which is an imagination of the proper order of collective, political, and commercial action. That is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. That is to say that when you build a technology, especially when you build one where scale is the point, where trying to get everyone on it became the modus operandi of Facebook in particular, to connect everyone. That also contains within it ideas about how our politics should work geopolitically, as well as how our economies should work. And if you look at the trajectory of Facebook from a social network where I'd be connected to friends and family and colleagues and schoolmates, what it's developed into, which is, where everyone is kind of their own, broadcast station, where you think less about, in some instances, particularly on YouTube and Twitter, social networking, you think about it as social media, which is to say that you're broadcasting to other people. You have an audience and they want content, right? And so social media has kind of found its way into the world without us really marking where it began, which was in the monetization of our social networks. And of course, the next formation, of course, that's the logical next step for social media, is actually going to be social banking, which is why we have to, even though none of us want to pay attention to conversation about Bitcoin and blockchain, we got to know, because this is where they're going, which is there's going to be a kind of currency of the net that is potentially going to destabilize a geopolitical order, obviously harming countries that have low monetary resources very quickly. And so we got to be on the watch for where these technologies are going, especially as we think about what does social media and the web really do. So I wrote this report with Matt Crane and Tony Nadler when I was at Data and Society about the digital influence machine, which is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. And I bring this up because what if I told you that Facebook was really just about getting ads in front of you? That's all it is. And what if I told you that everything you search for on Google that you click on that isn't behind a paywall is essentially Google monetizing the like landfill of content online that is already free? And so Google is just serving you like what is cheap and free information, because that's what becomes popular. Um, you know, you, uh, in terms of Twitter as well, it's really an advertising platform, as is YouTube. When if you think about even how you interact with the internet, we've all kind of trained our eyes not to look at the sidebars, because that's where the advertising normally is. And so we kind of like go right in the middle. Facebook really and Twitter really pioneered inline advertising, where you can pay just a little bit extra to get your ads into the news feed or the timeline. And so I offer this up to you so that you can understand that we actually pay the price for social media. We pay the price for misinformation. So I went before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which is a long way of saying the government in the US is now very interested in how misinformation and conspiracy really create problems for governance, right? They create problems for Adam Schiff, and they create problems for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and even our vice president. The insurrection and the storming of the Capitol is really an important marker of how, when misinformation grows out of control, it can actually convince people that they are being stolen from, that their democracy is in peril, and that if they don't do something about it, that potentially no one else will. And so our government in the US over the next couple of years is going to be looking in depthly at how does something like that scale? How do conspiracies scale? How do they go viral? And I've been very interested in understanding this from the perspective of, well, if misinformation's part of the business model, that is to say that all of these companies are making a lot of money to keep you on their platforms, and certain content that goes viral usually is content that makes you think, uh-oh, like, I got to know this, right? And if I don't share it, my friends aren't going to know this. And so there's something about misinformation that is both about the brokenness of our local news ecosystem, the brokenness of our journalism, the partisanship by which has taken over our information systems. And so it's really important that we understand that everybody else tasked with cleaning up the mess and the wreckage of misinformation are also harmed by it. That includes journalists who've had to write thousands of stories debunking any kind of viral conspiracy theory. Think about all the journalism getting poured into QAnon lately, which is a bizarro um, theory. But it is scaled to the point where, Facebook had to take down hundreds of thousands of accounts that were spreading this conspiracy theory. Public health professionals, every time a doctor has to field a call that, where someone's asking, is the COVID-19 test putting microchips up my nose? That's the effect of misinformation. And I've talked to many doctors over the last year who have said, where is this even coming from? Like, how do I can't deal with this. Like, it's crazy. And so those people are paying the price. Our civil society leaders who have to get up and say, yeah, actually, it wasn't Black Lives Matter that stormed the Capitol. I know you think it was because there's a massive amount of misinformation online, but really just take a look at those flags and those Trump hats and all the signals that say these are white people and this is a white person's problem. So civil society leaders have been called in to have to say, actually, these were Trump supporters. Come on. But that's the effect of being able to scale a lie, or to get a lie in front of millions of people. And then, of course, our public service sector. There are so many people that volunteered to run our elections that will never do it again, because of the ways in which people showed up to the polls in a very aggressive stance to try to say that the election was being rigged. And so there's lots and lots of ways in which the rest of our world has had to deal with misinformation and conspiracy. I want to close by just giving you a concept to think through as we enter into discussion around racialized disinformation. Racialized disinformation, the strategy is usually these are campaigns that employ the strategic use of falsified racial or ethnic identities and focus on race as a wedge issue. So, race as a way to really split public conversation and make it very difficult for us to come together. This strategy was most well known for being employed by the Russians during the 2016 US election, where Russian operatives pretended to be Black Lives Matter on Facebook and Twitter and essentially said a lot of things, none of them very pro Trump, but many of them anti Hillary Clinton or just throw your hands in the air. The US government is trash. Don't participate. Don't vote. And so the strategy of racialized disinformation, of course, has its roots in many different decades before social media, decades of issues related to the failure of the US government to pay any heed to reconciliation, any no truth and justice commissions, but also um, the way in which race is utilized by each party as a cudgel to kind of essentially beat up on one another without actually looking at the issues that matter to um, people who are not white, specifically in the US. But what we saw was the use of technology to cloak who you were. So you had Russians pretending to be Black Americans, basically saying this is how everybody should vote. And we actually did see a massive decline in, not massive, but a very big decline in voting, especially among Black populations in 2016. They were just not interested in Hillary Clinton. And part of that is that Hillary Clinton's not that interesting. That's one thing. But also part of it is the effect of this information operation. So we have a report up on our website written by Brandy Collins Dexter, who is a senior fellow on our team. And she writes about the effects of misinformation on Black communities, especially COVID-19 misinformation. She writes, the Black community is awash in medical misinformation about the coronavirus pandemic. Even as Black people are disproportionately dying from the virus due to systemic racism, harmful inaccuracies about how to keep from contracting COVID-19, how to treat it, and where it comes from are metastasizing in Black online spaces, putting people at even greater risk. So this is really important for us to understand that the information environment that people are utilizing and trusting is being laced with misinformation that makes them, it's basically the basis on which they make their health decisions. And so if people don't have accurate information and local and timely and relevant information, they're stuck kind of believing what they see. And sometimes it's just speculation. Other times it's much more insidious and harmful. So she identifies 4 myths about COVID-19 that were circulating within Black communities early on in the pandemic. 1, Black people could not die from COVID-19. 2, the virus was man-made for the purposes of population control. So that's a kind of early riff on the coronavirus as a bioweapon. The virus could be contained through the use of herbal remedies, or 5G radiation was the root cause of COVID-19. So many of you who are, not Black probably have seen some of these as a, some of these conspiracies because they do, or some of this misinformation because it did become a much bigger issue. But within certain spaces where people do try to cultivate a level of trust and understanding, as what happens within Black online spaces, these were really important points of contention, which people were trying to work out by talking to one another and trying to figure out, well, on what basis, what evidence do we have? And so she really goes through and says, there's serious problems here with the way in which our information environment is structured. There's unmoderated conspiracy. So Cedric the Entertainer posted on his Instagram this link to this Bill Gates video about coronaviruses. The Gates Foundation, of course, has been interested in global health for a very long time, and coronavirus is something, is a broad uh, topic, like it's a broad species of virus. COVID-19 is the much more specific name of what we're struggling with right now. But in this case, this video was being trafficked around the net as being proof that Gates was planting coronavirus in the world, or that he had something to gain from it as well. This Twitter post by a Black singer-songwriter, Carrie Hilson, she has over 4 million followers on Twitter. This post was eventually removed, including a series of posts linking COVID-19 to 5G technology. So here again, we have celebrities getting into the mix, stage 3 here, and amplifying the conspiracy that 5G was causing coronavirus. As well, there's unchecked influence. That is celebrities coming out and just throwing into the world dangerous speculation. This one from Elon Musk, who said the coronavirus panic is dumb. And then other people started, sharing this message that Black people cannot get coronavirus. This idea that there's something in their blood that was naturally resistant to it. As well, there was a NBA player who said, not making light of it at all. Serious question. Has a Black person got coronavirus yet? Right? This changes how you think about, do I wear a mask? Do I go out in public? If you think you are immune, you're going to behave differently. And so we actually need to have a way for influencers and people with very high attention online, or people who have millions of followers. We need to have a way to have them do proper sort of public stewardship of their social media, so that we don't get into this position where people are dangerously speculating that certain groups are going to be immune to future epidemics and pandemics. As well, unregulated markets. I'm sure, like me, all of you, the moment this stuff started, you go online, you're looking for masks, you're looking for hand sanitizer. Heck, in the US, we ran out of toilet paper. People are ordering their toilet paper online. And so what that actually does is create a set of markets and incentives for hoaxers and scammers to get in and say, oh, I've got N95 masks. Oh, I've got a cure for coronavirus. And so it's really important that we understand that when things are being sold on social media right now, there are no rules. Governments have to work on figuring out, well, what are the rules of people running essentially a scam through Facebook that says, click this link, buy these masks, and then of course nothing ever shows up. And in moments of panic, especially in moments where there's a competition for supplies, they need to have very strict rules about how people purchase things online and what you can advertise and what the penalties are if you're advertising bunk products. Which leads me to conclude that, the big problem right now is misinformation is everybody's problem. It's just, it's invading and upsetting in all of our different in all of the different spheres of our lives. I wrote this with Claire Wardle, who's another prominent researcher in this area. I'll throw the link in the chat. But basically, what we need to do is create a situation in which timely, relevant, accurate, and local information is served up online alongside all of our entertainment and our sports and our journalism. Much like in the US, we had to carve out public interest obligations for radio. So, you turn on the radio and you're just jamming to your tunes. Maybe it's Fleetwood Mac, maybe it's Rihanna. You don't want a DJ piping in and saying, well, later today, we're going to have a city council meeting and the mayor's declared a snow emergency, right? You just want to hear your music. Right. But in the US, we had to carve out these public interest obligations to ensure that people had access to timely, local, relevant, and accurate information in a steady stream. And we haven't insisted on similar public interest obligations for social media, but I think the time is now. So, open to questions. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's so nice to see some familiar faces. And hi, Mom. It's good to see you. And yeah, and these are all the ways you can get in touch with us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it over to Stephen and Anna.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Joan. And I'm sure we all appreciated the work that you put into preparing for today. I certainly found it very interesting, and some aspects that I hadn't considered were brought to mind. I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Philip Onguny now, who will be the discussant. And then after Philip, we'll maybe go to some questions. I've already got some coming through the chat. Thank you. So I would just remind people, if they want to ask a question, if they can send it to me directly in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Donovan, for the great presentation and for your engaging talk on this topic that has become an interesting area, I guess, to many of us, given the current media and information ecosystem. There's a lot really to unpack from your talk, but I will limit my intervention to few points that stood out for me. And that way we can have more time for the Q&A. So the first point really, I think your talk really foregrounds the effects of misinformation on the trust that people have toward existing institutions, especially the government institutions, and particularly their ability to really engage people in meaningful public discourse about policy issues that I think are important. But again, while the issue of disinformation is nothing new, I guess the question that really comes to mind here is what kind of strategies these institutions can adopt to peel back some of the unfounded claims that sometimes, as you mentioned, they go viral, however crazy they may seem to be. The second point that I would like to make, and I think it that you raised really, is that we are increasingly witnessing eroding role of journalists, particularly traditional journalists, and also other gatekeepers of thought, especially in trying to defend basic truth values, right? With increased information overload and the ability to alter some of this information for convenient interpretations. You talked about the Steve Bannon's case. Now, users' engagement with different sources of information, I think, has changed significantly, right? And the question that we may ask, for instance, is, are these unconventional sources becoming better at storytelling compared to the so-called reliable sources, right? We are seeing more and more political elites finding it difficult to influence public discourse on important issues, and they are losing ground, I guess, to conspiracy theorists who seem to have found some innovative ways, such as recontextualization that you talked about, but also misinfographics, in both conventional and unconventional platforms. The other also probably question that may come to mind is particularly with the eroding role of gatekeepers and also traditional journalism, we may wonder how, for instance, the algorithms are influencing users' online experience and also their ability to filter information in their own, right? You gave the example of increasingly we are witnessing monetization, of content by Google, but also by YouTube, and I believe there's the role of algorithms in all this as well. Now, the third point that I would also like to point out from your presentation is that we are also seeing the growing power of these giant tech companies, especially in content moderation, right? And these companies appear to have the same, if not even more power than the government institutions in determining what constitutes misinformation. You gave the example of Twitter labels, for instance, but we can also think of the recent coalition of other giant tech companies such as Google, Apple, and Amazon in limiting platforms such as Parler and also the Gab, the far-right platform, from circulating certain contents. Now, the question that comes to mind with this really is, what can policymakers do to regain some of this power that is kind of slipping away without necessarily overstepping the boundaries of free speech, which I think is important. And the final point that I would like to make relates to that you also pointed out. I thought it was quite interesting, is the effect of misinformation on partisan identities, what you call racialized disinformation. On one hand, we are seeing movements such as Black Lives Matter pushing for certain recognition while adopting, obviously, particular narratives. And on the other hand, we are also seeing white supremacists also pushing for recognition based on other kinds of narratives. But what this does is that it leaves kind of little room for civil dialogue between various groups or identities, if you will. And this, I guess, threatens what Francis Fukuyama recently, or in his recent book, called the credo national identity. In other words, given the current information ecosystem, how can we really ensure that that we are not becoming too politically correct at the expense, say, of genuine and frank public discourse on issues that affect all of us, such as immigration, while at the same time not leaning too far right to a point where basic truths no longer matter. So those are the 4 points, and I guess the questions that I had that we can discuss, but also including the Q&A session. So I will stop there and I will hand it over to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I'd just like to ask Joan if she'd like to make any counter observations on what you said before opening up. I've got several questions that I'm going to move on to in the next phase. So Joan, do you have anything you'd like to comment back on Philip's commentary?
Yeah, I'd love, the comments that you made, because I think there's a few things, and I see in the chat here one about wanting some more concrete methods that educators can use. Question from Rhonda about this. It's what's hard is that the first line intervention into this space was around this phenomenon of fake news. Now, politically, the phenomenon of fake news was like Trump pointing at CNN and saying, "You're fake news." Technologically, the phenomenon of fake news was you had like tens of thousands of websites online that were cloaked to look as if they were ABC, NBC, CBC, Global, right? This was actual fake news. And what they were trying to do is kind of steal a little bit of the shine of the brand in order to just get clicks, likes, and shares to drive engagement. So what they figured out, though, was they had to move beyond, listicles that said, here are the 10 best cat memes, and move into political content, because they realized that people love to share partisan news. They just loved it, and it was a good business model. So the first intervention into this space is actually prior to the 2016 election, around the work that the great journalist Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed Canada was doing to say, there's a phenomenon happening on the net where people think they're reading news, and what they're reading is an imposter site that will literally say anything in order to gin up controversy. So the internet actually introduces a vulnerability into our information ecosystem that, a century of news making practices had built up, right? Like, journalists have ethics, and if you don't work within the ethical code of journalism, people call you out. You don't get to keep working at, the New York Times, for instance, if you don't behave ethically and within the established patterns of fact that you need to do to be called a journalist. And so the internet and social media really introduced this very open information environment where some people tried to turn those professional distinctions to their advantage by saying, well, in some for good reason, activists would say, well, I'm a citizen journalist, right? And what they really were was a kid with a phone and a backpack. And that's okay. I'm for that. I like, that's my favorite kind of media, is to watch live streams like direct from the ground. But that's not the same as having an investigative unit at your at CTV, or at the Globe and Mail, that can go deep on a subject and actually get at some semblance of fact and truth. And so the internet actually introduces a vulnerability into our news ecosystem that we have yet to reckon with and understand. One way that I think we could insist as educators to fix that is to help people understand, especially our students, more about news gathering, sourcing, reliability. Many of our students get information from TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube. And for them, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. If it feels true, it kind of counts as true. So with the opportunity we have as educators, I often tell my students, I open class with two basic frames, which is one, the devil doesn't need an advocate. So ask questions authentically and help me understand what you want to know. And second, I don't say you can't bring certain sources into the classroom. What I try to get them to develop is a habit of verification, where they are able to say, across, every media organization is going to have some kind of bias, but across the field, do the stories seem to be saying the same thing? Are they establishing the same patterns of fact? And I also get them to try to understand timing, which is, most disinformation happens like within the 4 to 8 hours after a breaking news event. So that window when fact finding is happening is when disinformation is most potent. It's when it's traveling the furthest. It's when it's breaking through other echo chambers. And that's actually an effect of the algorithms, and the way in which algorithms, when people are seeking attention, the role of the algorithm is to find the thing that would satisfy that attention seeking. And then it does a kind of +1. It tries to recommend you something similar. It doesn't care if it's true. It actually cannot know if it's true. It actually cannot know if it's left or right, really. especially in breaking news, unless they've tethered their algorithms to understand more about the account holders themselves, which is why we see disinformation operators tend to have dozens, if not hundreds of accounts. And it's because they're constantly trying to configure how the algorithm will surface information in a moment. And so I think there's a lot to understand, but I think the major point I want to get across is the one of power, which is to say that usually every time we see an effective disinformation campaign, it's an effect of people with money and political power using means and the features of our information ecosystem to either, make money or to advance their political agenda. And that's where I think any kind of regulation or anything that our governments are going to have to do is it's really about reining in the powerful. And I'm hoping that that actually opens up space for more normal folk to have everyday conversations that they want to have that may be partisan, may be heated, but are not going to be artificial in the ways that we've seen public agendas, public conversations be engineered by disinformers. Sorry, I took up way too much time there. I can go till 110 if necessary.
Stephen, are you frozen?
It looks like we've lost. Yeah, Stephen's not there.
Oh no.
He's here. he's just a cat.
Well, that's unfortunate because Stephen has
Oh no.
the questions.
That's all the questions. Oh,
while we're waiting for him, yeah, Sheena had a question that she put in the chat, Joan. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah,
he's back.
Zoom just crashed on me, so that was an interesting experience. Panic over. So yeah, we got some questions. Thanks very much, Joan, for answering. Philip, I'll be as quick as I can with the questions. The first one is, do you recognize any differences between state and corporate actors and individuals and activists in respect of intent and effect?
Very much so. We should not mistake what hashtag movements like Standing Rock, Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, we shouldn't mistake what they do, which is organizing for disinformation. Both are coordinated behavior, but one is happening in the open where people are not lying about who they are or what their intent is. And the other has these other features, which is that they're trying to deceive you and trying to deceive the public in mass, trying to deceive journalists. And so it's that deception that we have to get at.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question was from my colleague, Sheena Pietrobruno. So Sheena, can I unmute you so you can ask your question? I think you, Sheena, I think you need to, that's it now. Yep.
There we go.
Should I just read it?
Yep, that's fine.
I don't know where it is. Actually, could you read it for me? Because I don't see it.
Okay.
And then I'll comment.
Okay, the question is, in light of your work on the white supremacist distortion of the genetic ancestry testing findings, could you comment on recent DNA results of Viking ethnic origins, i.e. Samis, South European, Asian, Scandinavian, conducted at the University of Copenhagen, and the way that these DNA results could be transformed into disinformation on white supremacist websites, discussion forums, and beyond? So,
yeah, so years ago, I did some research looking at how whiteness is maintained, via researching white supremacists' use of DNA ancestry tests. And we looked at message boards where people are discussing their results. But by and large, what we found was there were 6 different strategies people would use to maintain their whiteness. So it wasn't the case that you would get test results and say, oh, I'm actually Asian, or it shows that I'm African, therefore I should dispense with these white nationalist worldviews. Instead, they had all kinds of ways of, either going back to family records and saying, well, this can't be true, or to say that the company that they went to for the testing was actually controlled by, you guessed it, the Jews, right? And so for them, like, truth making was really about what the community counted as evidence for making boundaries about whiteness. Now, the Viking question is an interesting one in the sense that I think within these groups, it could be used as vindication, as saying that there is a kind of purity, a kind of white, and with the Viking question being one of what does that mean culturally about conquest and dominance and taking by force, right? So all of the great tropes that come with being a Viking, of course, as a way to legitimate, the ways in which white people have often taken by force land and just taken over and decimated other groups and cultures. And so I do think what it does is it just kind of adds volume to the conversation. I don't know if it will necessarily break out and become a thing on its own. But it does provide, at least in the media, an opportunity for white supremacists to get some attention, especially if they can get, one of the effects is like something like this will come out, research will come out, and then journalists will want to cover it, and they'll be looking for sources. And so they'll go on Twitter and literally look up the study to see who's talking about it. And then they'll contact that person. If their Twitter bio says there's someone that's a university professor or someone that has any particular knowledge on it, they're like, aha, I found a source. And so white supremacists have become adept at shaping their Twitter bios to make it look like they're part of advocacy organizations, particularly ones that are, present themselves as being very interested in immigration. For instance, they'll have a very broad title like the Center for Immigration Studies. But when you look down at it, it's really, an anti-immigration outfit. And so studies like this do add a media opportunity for white supremacists to get in and have, and to kind of spread their worldview. But it's important then that journalists actually think more about who they source information from and how they do it. We saw this happen very recently, a couple years ago, with the opiate crisis, where white supremacists jumped into action and they were like, we're going to have a bunch of protests called White Lives Matter protests. And, just kind of all of a sudden they cared about opiate use because they saw an opportunity to get in front of the media and say that white people were being marginalized. And so that's how I worry about something like that, is I start to think about, well, what kind of opportunities does it introduce for them to get into public conversation?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Dale Wallishin. And for speed, I'll probably just read it myself. So many people, e.g. Trump supporters or those duped by misinformation, would argue that either it really isn't misinformation or that it's not unfair. Either the other side does it, or in a free society, recipients beware. Therefore, how do we come up with a common understanding of what is unfair manipulation and what is unfairness?
It's a good question. I try to think about it in terms of volume rather than one of technique at that point, which is to say that if someone puts something into the world that is deceptive and manipulative and 8 people on YouTube watch it, do we need to be concerned? Maybe not, right? I mean, there are going to be people wrong. Like, there's no communication without misinformation. One thing I think we need to do is build the muscle with technology companies to be able to spot things that they can and make those determinations early on, so that people know that if you are using an anonymous account and you've stolen the logo of a news organization and you are CNBC plus, then, maybe you're not, who you say you are, right? And so I think that there's questions about where the technology companies actually have to produce those guardrails. But then there are other spaces where if it does reach 100,000 people, maybe then we need different kinds of rules that not only incentivize companies to kind of try to block and tackle misinformation, but also incentivize people to want to keep their accounts. There's a certain kind of dance that some of these disinformers have to do once they become very popular. To grow an account to 250,000 viewers on YouTube, for instance, they don't want to lose that. And so there certainly black market sale of what's called seasoned accounts that you can buy old accounts on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook that already have a posting history. But once you put that kind of effort into growing an audience, into cultivating those folks, they don't want to lose that. So how do you build in incentives that say, hey, if you get to that stage and then flip a switch and become a disinformer or start taking money from some kind of dark money operation and start spreading misinformation, we're not going to let you do that. I say that because one of the prominent Russian accounts that kind of turned in 2016 really cultivated their audience by talking about the Kardashians. They had been quoted in popular gossip magazines, and they were just like avid TV watchers that people were like, oh yeah, they're funny and it's cool and they've got cool memes and like, I'm just going to follow this Twitter account. And then as it got closer to the election, switch right into disinformation. And so we have to be wary for that switching point as well and say, okay, like what is the patterns here and why the change? As well, like the other thing we have to be cognizant of that's happening a lot that not a lot of people are talking about is politicians are paying influencers to place, nice content about them, a comment saying, hey, I really enjoy Joey Biden's. He's great. I'm like, I make a joke, of course. His name is Joe Biden. But, that's the kind of stuff you get when it's sponsored content is they're like, oh, I just got to say this thing, right? And they get their, $1,500. But we have to look at that level of sponsored content and get into it so that we can understand more about how our information environment is being influenced by unfair means.
Okay,
Fortunately, I
do we
think
have
we
time for
probably have
one
to
last
wrap.
question? Do we have time for one
Let me
last
just
question?
look
or-
at this calendar here because I do need to have a tiny bit of lunch. Okay, one more question.
Okay, one last question. Thank you. I really appreciate that. The question is from Pavel. Given the growth of misinformation, public institutions and politicians have to address and ultimately give people more attention, sometimes in the mainstream media, which become more moderated. So do you believe that in some cases, attempts to debunk or mitigate misinformation actually helps it spread and allows the misinformation to thereby reach even more people who are maybe not as active as others on social media? So by the act of debunking, are we actually promoting?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in an academic paper with Dana Boyd called Stop the Presses, Moving from Strategic Silence to Strategic Amplification in a Networked Media Ecosystem. All that jargon basically means that it used to be that it was much harder to hoax the media. It was much harder to introduce lies into major press outlets. It was possible, but it required quite a bit of resources and ingenuity to get the Washington Post to platform lies. The internet's introduced circumvention. And so this is why we see politicians utilizing conspiracy to gain popularity, because conspiracy networks are posters too. Like they will post about you if you talk about the things they care about. And I think that in this moment with amplification, we have to realize that the gates that we would have considered like the gatekeepers of old have lost some measure of control about how the public is going to discuss certain issues. Those gates are now firmly in the hands of social media companies who refuse to recognize that they are immensely political and immensely powerful corporations. And you can hear it even as they don't want to even talk about themselves as a corporation, right? Even in the language of tech, this notion of a startup, right? This idea, like, you know, they don't want to admit that they're part of the business class and that their products are important to all of us. But they don't, in failing to recognize the role they play as a media gatekeeper, it actually makes the rest of the media ecosystem much more vulnerable. And unfortunately, journalists often are in this position where they have to debunk things because their readers are starting to ask them about it. Their readers are saying, I heard this thing. Hey, does coronavirus, does that affect Black people? I don't know. Right? Like the readers are seeing this stuff and saying, what do you think? And so we're in this really tight bind because the responsibility for misinformation has been passed off onto journalists, onto public health. And journalism, I think, can only do so much without technology companies realizing the power that they have taken, and that with the money that they make, that they have an immense responsibility to the rest of society to ensure that we have timely, local, relevant, and accurate information on demand. Which is to say that these are not toys. These are not playthings. This is, you know, this is our health, our well-being, our education, our journalism. All of our truth-telling institutions are implicated now, and we gotta fix it, right? And so I've advised, even not just on the amplification question, but I've advised, you know, that tech companies hire 10,000 librarians and start to deal with curation, so that when you search for did the Holocaust happen, yeah, you find out that it did. Because the other way that it happens is that anyone who's got a little bit of money and a little bit of network power can ensure that their results rise to the top on every social media platform. And in doing so, if you were to search for did the Holocaust happen, there are a lot of people who are invested in saying, no, it didn't. And so it's really important that we understand that what's at stake here is not just that we have a human right to the truth, but that there are costs, very severe social penalties for doing nothing and leaving it as it exists. And so I hope that everybody here on this call thinks differently about the media they consume, how they use the internet, and make sure that, you know, within their own communities, they become beacons for sharing accurate information, no matter how boring it is. Everybody needs to hear time and time again that the coronavirus is real and here's how to get tested. And in doing so, I hope it's just a glitch that we're in. I hope there is a future in which misinformation at scale doesn't harm all of us. Thanks for sticking with me.
Okay, well,
Great.
thank you so much for the wonderful time you spent with us and the sharing your insight into this subject. And it's obviously you've got a lot of work invested in this and a lot of publications. So I'm sure we'll be posting links to the work that you talked about in the presentation today, in the seminar. So I can only thank you so much for sharing time with us. I'm conscious that you have to go. I also wanted to thank Philip and Anna for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to ask the questions. Thank you so much. It's truly appreciated.
Thank you. And thank you, Philip, for your measured response. I appreciate it. Everybody have a great night and enjoy the rest of your days. It's been beautiful. Thank you.